So it's my pleasure to introduce Tamar Gendler, who's going to talk about feeling good, about feeling bad, moral aliefs, and moral dilemmas. And if you're discovering that the title contains a word you haven't heard, it means you haven't been reading Tamar Gendler. Tamar has the distinction of having discovered, or some critics will say invented, a new propositional attitude called aliefs. I must confess, being in the embarrassing position of introducing her, I really don't believe in aliefs. But I do sort of alief. So with that, here's Tamar the board.
Good. So thanks so much. Am I audible in the back?
Yes.
So it's ironic that I'm at this conference on the moral brain because I don't do neuroscience and I don't do ethics. But I'm going to put up one slide with pictures of the brain and then try to situate what I want to say in the context of a broader philosophical tradition, which has been adverted to in a number of the talks, either explicitly or tacitly, over the past couple of days, and try to say something about the ways in which I think the 2,500-year-old tradition about thinking seriously about the nature of moral reasoning in the Western philosophical tradition may help mutually illuminate some of the concerns that have come up in the context of this conference. So this slide is a social neuroscience slide suggesting that there are two kinds of systems that operate in the brain, one a relatively automatic system and the other a relatively controlled system. But of course, that's not a hypothesis which is new to the 21st century. Plato, 2,500 years ago, spoke of human beings as having what he called a tripartite soul. There was, on the one hand, a charioteer reason, which was directive, and on the other hand, two parts of the soul which were impulsive in certain sorts of ways. Plato called them spirit and appetite. And the bulk of his great work, The Republic, is devoted to the question, how ought human beings to deal with the fact that they have multi-part souls, and what sorts of relations among those parts are ones that allow human beings to maximally flourish. His student Aristotle took up the same question, distinguishing not between reason and two other parts, but just between a rational part and a non-rational part of the soul. And the early modern tradition, 1,500 years later, concerned itself in many ways with a similar dichotomy. So early modern philosophers, from Descartes onward, are concerned with the relation between reason and what they call the passions. So reason, spirit, and appetite, reason and the non-rational part of the soul, reason and passion, these are traditional conflicts. Middle of the 18th century, along comes David Hume and asks us to recognize the existence of a third horse as well. We might call this the horse of association. And Hume says, what should we do about the fact that we are beings capable of both rational thought and subject to the creation of associations? William James, at the turn of the 20th century, asks about the relation between reason on the one hand and habit on the other. Daniel Kahneman, as Josh Green pointed out yesterday, asks about the relation between what he calls System 2, a relatively regulated set of processes on the one hand, and System 1, a cluster of relatively autonomous systems that respond to the world automatically and quickly without straightforward regulation by reason. John Barge distinguishes between controlled and automatic processes. Mazar Banaji distinguishes between explicit and implicit attitudes. All of these are ways of capturing the same sort of insight. The insight that on the one hand we have a mode of engaging in the world that is based on reason, rationality, and a certain sort of capacity for reflection. And on the other hand, we have a cluster of ways of relating to the world that are not so subject. But there is absent from traditional folk psychological descriptions of our experience any intuitive way of capturing this sort of distinction. And it's with that idea in mind that I, in my youth, back when I was calm and in front of a large number of rhododendrons, coined a term, alief, which is meant roughly to capture this cluster of psychological features. And I'm fortunate to have here today a speaker of American Sign Language who has given me not only a way of expressing alief in English, but a way of expressing alief in ASL. So let me, right now, with great thanks to Professor Teresa Burke of bioethicist at Gallaudet University, introduce you to the ASL, newly coined here today, term for alief, and then I'll explain to those of you who have no idea what I'm talking about, what this sign is meant to pick out. So apparently, the way one expresses the thought belief in ASL is this. It's thought and then a commitment. And so the ASL term for alief is thought and habit. Thought connecting up to habit. And the term alief, which is built out of numerous puns of words starting with A, is also pun-like in ASL because both of my hands, when I say habit, are formed into the ASL characters for the letter A. Okay, so a brilliant, absolutely brilliant point on the part of Professor Burke in this regard. So what am I talking about when I talk about aliefs? Let me say something about this and then connect it to the set of concerns that we're confronting at this conference. So suppose we go to the Grand Canyon in Arizona, and I take you out on this horseshoe-shaped glass walkway, which is suspended 4,000 feet above the roaring river that carved out the Grand Canyon. Or we go to the Sears Tower in Chicago, where 1,800 feet above the roaring streets of the city, one can stand in a glass box that protrudes from the side of the building and look down and see before you nothing but 1,800 feet of air. In those circumstances, it seems to me unquestionable that what one's belief amounts to is that one is in a situation of safety. If you had even a modicum of doubt, if you were even uncertain in the way that you are about whether you perhaps won the New Jersey lottery, you would not be standing out on this glass surface. You would quickly retreat back to a place where you knew you were safe. Nonetheless, despite the fact that you are fully, consciously, explicitly, completely committed to the surface you're standing on being exactly as safe as it would be if it were an opaque surface, you tremble and shake and shudder as you stand upon this. You have an alief with the content, yikes, I am really high up, this is absolutely terrifying, I am in grave danger. And in fact, the philosopher Hume discusses exactly this phenomenon in a famous example where he speaks of a man suspended in the air in an iron cage, where he knows the walls of the cage to be completely solid, but nonetheless, because of the visual experience he has suspended in the air, trembles and shakes and shudders. Suppose we're watching a movie, and a character in the film, usually with an audience of this age, people recognize this person, usually students who were born after he finished his presidency do not. So we're watching the film, and a character on the screen picks up a gun and points it out towards the room. I believe when that happens that I'm totally safe. I don't think that there's a real risk that the bullets are going to jump off the screen and fly into the room when I'm watching the film. Nonetheless, I have a tendency to duck. I say, watch out. And speaking of watches, how many of you set yours 5 minutes fast? Okay. I set mine 5 minutes fast, and so when I see something like this, I have a very clear belief. My belief, when my watch reads when my watch says that it's this. Instead it's 10:05, so I rush and go where I need to be. Some of us watch sports games on television and yell, even when it's a rerun, to the character, run, run, go to second, go to second. Not because we believe that when we say to the character, go to second, our voice will go through the television set, back in time, to the stadium where the character is playing, but rather because we have an alief that is causing us to respond in that way. Many of us who wish to regulate our dietary intake may have the belief that something that looks like this is undesirable to eat, but nonetheless have the alief that is delicious and feel ourselves drawn towards it. Likewise with this piece of food, made from exactly the same ingredients as that on the left. This is coconut. This is Tootsie Rolls. I ran out of baking pans, but I used this. It's absolutely pristine. Oh, we couldn't find a spatula, but I sterilized this before I used it. This is a classic illustration of a Paul Rawson observation, which is that if you take a piece of fudge and you form it into the shape of feces, you will elicit the sort of responses that Professor Bloom was just describing. So even though it's my example, I'm a philosopher, I stipulate so it's true, you believe me that this is edible, nonetheless you will feel great reluctance to eat it. Here's an example from John Haidt. I present you with this contract, and I ask you to sign, I hereby declare that my soul belongs only to you, O Satan, 31st March, 2012, New York City, to get it past human subjects. I write, this is not a legal contract, it's simply a prompt and a psychology experiment, lest you be seduced by the font. This is Satan's big font. People express reluctance to sign on to this contract, not because they believe, oh, it really isn't a prompt and a psychology experiment, it is a legally binding contract, but rather because they have an alief that pulls them to hesitate. One might also set up, as Monica Bonvicini did, a restroom on a public street that has opaque walls of this kind, and when you walk up to make use of the restroom, it's clear to you that nobody can see inside. Nonetheless, people find it enormously difficult to make use of this facility, not because they believe that they are in any risk of being observed, but rather because of their beliefs. So what I want to do is to take this notion of alief and connect it up to a dispute between two philosophers in the Western tradition. Not exactly the two that Josh Green talked about yesterday. That is not Kant and Yale, but rather Kant and Aristotle. And to use those philosophical views about the nature of morality, which appeal, I think, to two alternate pictures of the appropriate relation between moral beliefs and moral aliefs, as a way of getting at some philosophical connections that might be drawn between that tradition and a number of the issues that were raised at the conference yesterday. So let me say at the outset that I am not a scholar of either Kant or of Aristotle, and that I won't be presenting nuanced versions of their views. I will rather be presenting what we might call potted Kant and potted Aristotle. Let me do that again. Potted Kant and potted Aristotle. I've been told, I've used this slide before, that in fact the image of potted is not about trees, it's about chopping up meat and putting it into a can. I think this is another nice use of the notion of potted. So here's Aristotle and Kant. And the distinction between them that I'm interested in exploring is one articulated here by Chris Korsgaard, who is a distinguished moral philosopher at Harvard. And Chris Korsgaard, who does know a lot about both Aristotle and Kant, writes that people like me who don't know a lot about Aristotle and Kant think the following. Philosophers have long supposed that Aristotle and Kant disagree about many fundamental issues in moral philosophy. Aristotle tells us that that an agent lacks virtue unless he enjoys the performance of virtuous actions, while in the groundwork, Kant seems to claim that a person who does her duty in the teeth of contrary inclination displays an especially high degree of moral worth. Now, since my concern is only with potted Aristotle and potted Kant, and not with Aristotle and Kant fully understood, I will content myself with the idea that there is at least a reading of some themes in Aristotle that some people have found compelling, according to which paradigmatic virtue involves what I would call a harmony between belief and alief, and a reading of certain aspects of the Kantian canon, which has captivated the thought of many philosophers over the last 200 years, according to which paradigmatic virtue involves a conflict between moral beliefs and moral aliefs. And there's textual support in favor of this. It's not for no reason that philosophers have long supposed that there is this distinction. So Aristotle emphasizes in the Nicomachean Ethics the importance of harmony among the parts of the soul in allowing a certain sort of human flourishing. And in fact, the bulk of the book, which is in many ways a parenting guide, is devoted to the question of how we cultivate habits of virtue. And I noticed that there's a talk on the program tomorrow by William Tastier on the neuroscientific basis of habit formation, which I presume operates within the context of this neo-Aristotelian tradition. So Aristotle, speaking of what it is to act in a morally virtuous way, where the notion of virtue at play is one, what is it that allows a human being to live a life wherein the person flourishes? The characterization he gives goes as follows. Actions are called just or temperate. Those are instances of moral virtues, to pick up on a theme that Walter St. Armstrong was stressing yesterday. Aristotle has a capacious sense of what the domain of what he would call the moral or the more generally the ethical involves. Actions are called just or temperate when they're the sort of actions that a just or temperate person would do. So, the very first condition you have on an action being a just or temperate one is that it be just or temperate. But that's not enough on the Aristotelian picture for an action to count as just or temperate. Or more precisely, that's not enough on the Aristotelian picture for the person carrying out the act to count as a just or temperate person. And on the Aristotelian picture, because what we're trying to cultivate is a certain sort of flourishing, our unit of analysis is a person extended over time. So the just and temperate person is not the one who merely does these actions. You don't really act in conformity with the demands of morality. But the one who does them in the way in which just or temperate people do them. What is that way? Well, here's what that way is. If someone who abstains from bodily pleasures enjoys the abstinence itself, then he's temperate. But if he's grieved by it, if he feels a tension among the parts of his soul, then he is intemperate, though engaged in self-regulation. If he stands firm against terrifying situations and enjoys it, or at least does not find it painful, then he is brave. If he finds it painful, if he feels an internal tension among the parts of his soul, he is cowardly. So in Aristotle's picture, what paradigmatic moral behavior amounts to is a kind of harmony between your reflective commitments and your carefully cultivated instinctive responses. Well, instinctive there doesn't mean uncultured. Instinctive means that which you have trained yourself through a long process of deliberate structuring of your environment and consequent habituation of your patterns of attention and subsequent emotional responses to feel. By contrast, Kant presents as the paradigmatically moral moment one wherein what you do is to rein in a tendency that's pulling you in a contrary direction. In the groundwork of the metaphysics of morals, Kant famously writes, there are many minds so sympathetically constituted that without any other motive of vanity or self-interest, they find a pleasure in spreading joy around them and take delight in the satisfaction satisfaction of others so far as it is their own work. But I maintain, says Kant, and this is the reason that many people think Kant holds the view that he goes on to articulate here. I maintain that in such a case, an action of this kind, however proper, however amiable it may be, has nevertheless no true moral worth, for the maxim lacks moral import, namely that such actions be done from duty, not from inclination. And he goes on to give the famous example of an individual who had previously been driven by the sort of empathic responses that Paul identified for us in the work of Darwin, but suddenly finds himself in a spirit of malaise. And Kant writes, put the case in mind of a philanthropist who, clouded by sorrow of his own, has his sympathy with the lot of others extinguished. And while he still has the power to benefit others in distress, he's not touched by their trouble because he's so absorbed with his own. So the natural sympathy of the sort that Paul described has been shut off because he's in a state of emotional turmoil. Now, says Kant, suppose that he tears himself out of this dead insensibility and performs an action without any inclination to it, but simply from duty. Then, for the first time, his action has moral worth. So you might think if Kant and Aristotle were judging competitors in the moral Olympics, Aristotle gives first place to the character that you might call the sophron. That's the individual who has cultivated their aliefs in such a way that the world presents itself to him or her morally in such a way that the other considerations don't even seem to be pressing demands. Walks around with that sort of feeling of sympathy and a tendency to act bravely and justly and continently and moderately and magnanimously, which is one of the Aristotelian virtues, though I don't know what it means. By contrast, Kant suggests that the winner of the moral Olympics is, notice that switch, right? I have to cut and paste these individually, so I'd like you to notice that. First place to the guy in the red shirt, watch this. Kant's giving first place to the guy in the blue shirt, the character that Aristotle would call the encrates, the one who is capable of self-regulation. So, to challenge somewhat the picture that Josh Green presented yesterday, we might take seriously the analogy that he gave us, that we have with respect to morality a kind of automatic system and a kind of manual system. But it seems to me that the matching up that he offered between this dial and these philosophers, or this philosopher, wasn't quite right. What Aristotle is concerned with doing is helping us to cultivate the most nuanced and impressive set of automatic functions on our camera imaginable. Now, Aristotle has been challenged on this ground by the situationist tradition in social psychology, and I'll have a bit to say about this later on. But Aristotle's basic picture is this. To the extent that you're operating in a relatively familiar and predictable world, you ought to be able to develop in yourself a menu of ways of dealing with situations such that they come to be so natural to you that they capture your attention and filter your experience in ways that preclude the consideration of other possible ways of being. Kant, by contrast, doesn't seem to me to be appealing to the automatic mode of processing at all. Rather, what Kant says is, for an act to count as morally virtuous, it needs to be done not just in keeping with, but indeed from the moral law. And what it is for an act to be done from the moral law is for it to be done as a result of a certain kind of contemplative exercise, one which, at least counterfactually, allows you to behave in a way that runs contrary to your inclination. In some sense, this is just an exegetical question about Kant. It doesn't matter as a deeper issue about positions within moral psychological space, but I think it's fair, since I was Josh Green's teaching assistant in the very first ethics course that he ever took, a course called Utilitarianism For and Against, where he skipped every other session. I feel this remedial moment of condemnation is becoming positive. All right. So what do I want to say about the human condition? Since I'm not going to talk about the brain, I might as well talk about the human condition. Well, what I want to say about the human condition is that Kant and Aristotle are both right, and so is Jonathan Edwards. Why? Well, Aristotle is right that given the sorts of creatures we are, fluency-demanding actions that involve interacting with the world in real time, basically needs to be driven by habit and belief. We're just not the sort of creatures that can be setting our camera dials all the time. We need to walk around photographing the world on autopilot. Because of the ways we're built, a large proportion of our real-time responses are, as a matter of fact, governed by aliefs rather than beliefs. So unless our habits or beliefs or inclinations have been cultivated to be responsive to the normal demands of morality, we will be unable to act in ordinary day-to-day interactions in the ways that morality demands. The naturalized version of this is, of course, the sort of argument that you get in Darwin, the sort of argument that Paul was presenting, the sort of argument that you get in any of the classic evolution of cooperation literature, according to which one of the things which human beings have in them is the capacity to find this sort of behavioral natural. So, just to give an example of what I mean here, we're unable to engage in fluid interracial interactions unless, if we have implicit negative racial associations that are cognitively available at the time of interaction. So, huge amount of research, and I'll present some specific cases in a minute, but a huge amount of research in the implicit bias tradition focuses on the ways in which cognitive availability of stereotypical categories in any hierarchical situation, race is one, gender is another, social class is another, disability is another, all of these are domains with respect to which individuals for whom it is salient at the moment that there's some kind of asymmetry in the relation between one individual and another, stumble with regard to the fluency of their interaction. So there's real-time moral demands which are made on us in the world, which are unavailable for us to follow unless we've cultivated the right kinds of moral beliefs. But Aristotle doesn't get all the riches. It's also the case that there are instances of actions that need to be exception-responsive. An exception-responsive action has to be reflection or belief-driven. In non-typical situations, by definition, our habitual or belief-driven responses will not track moral demands. That's what it is for the world to have an exceptional situation, even if they're well cultivated to track moral demands in typical situations. So, obey authority, a reasonably good habit to cultivate in yourself. Obey authority if it's wearing a white coat and in a nice building on the campus of a great university. Seems like a reasonable tendency to cultivate in terms of pro-moral behavior. But it will lead you, should you find yourself in one of the northern experiments, doing things that on reflection you might find problematic. In such circumstances, reflection-based, belief-driven override is required for moral behavior. And this is true not only in things like the Milgram experiments, but as I'll go on to discuss in a few minutes in the paper, in all of the sorts of moral dilemmas which have served as one of the impetuses for discussing discussion in the neuroscience of morality literature. So in any harm help case, well-cultivated inclinations will run contrary to the demands of morality, and a certain kind of override is going to be needed. However, tragedy, self-fluency demanding actions are actions that need to be exception responses. There are non-typical situations where you need to act quickly, and you need to act quickly in ways that are possible for you to act only if you cultivate in yourself tendencies towards behavior that are typically non-moral. So it may well be, let me give an example and then let me say something about the relation between this and the situations and attitudes literature. So in some non-typical situations, morality will demand real-time responses, but those with generally morality tracking aliefs will be unable to perform. Having generally pro-moral aliefs precludes morally correct behavior in certain situations. We are destined to sinners, as Jonathan Edwards puts it, sinners in the hands of an angry God. So one example of this, and I'll talk about this at the end of the lecture, is if you assume that there are such things as just wars, and you assume that wars are winnable only if it's possible for you to fire quickly in the face of an enemy, it will be the case that it is incumbent upon you to cultivate certain sorts of responses that are counter-moral, that come to be instinctive and natural for you. Now, one of the interesting things is that it is possible, and the quote from Darwin that I'm going to show you in a few minutes adverts precisely to this. It's possible to cultivate domain-specific tendencies to harm. So doctors are very likely to cut up individuals lying prone before them in an operating setting. But, one hopes, not so likely to cut up individuals lying prone before them when they, for example, find themselves at the beach. It would be unfortunate if an exposed midriff elicited situation generally in doctors, a tendency to remove a scalpel. So the fact that our domains of moral interaction are circumscribed in the way that the situationist literature has shown us over the last 40 or 50 years is, I think, enormously valuable. One of the problems with something like war, and one of the problems in the anti-torture literature, is that when ordinary objects are required to take on different meanings for an individual, it becomes very difficult to circumscribe the sorts of responses that are appropriate. So one of the reasons it's been hypothesized that it is so traumatic for soldiers who have been involved in guerrilla warfare in places like Vietnam or in places like Iraq, where nothing in the experienced world can be trusted as safe, is because they cultivate in themselves a tendency to be hair-trigger fearful of anything in the environment. And there's nothing like the domain of the operating room to circumscribe that response. And so getting aliefs back in line when one re-enters a civilian domain is an enormous challenge for individuals who have been placed in a situation where the demands of what it is to respond appropriately to an uncertain world have unsettled certain kinds of habitual patterns of response. Okay, so that's the kind of big picture. Aristotle's right, Kant's right, Jonathan Edwards is right. And in the 10 minutes I have left, or 10 minutes I've been talking? Like 8 or 10 to 45, or? Oh, really? Huh. Okay. It's a pity. I wonder what I'll do. Okay. Let me suggest what a brilliant idea. Jenny says I should really talk quickly. I'm sure everybody would completely appreciate my doing that, especially the interpreter for you. Okay. All right. So let me skip most of my arguments and get to the dilemma. conceptually, where Aristotle is the placeholder for belief and belief harmony, in certain attitude involving interpersonal interactions, things like love and friendship. What it is to exhibit the relevant moral behavior is to perform it as the result of concordant attitudes. In such cases, we might say that the moral action is in part constituted by alief-belief harmony. And I had here a slide, which I won't read to you. It's a famous old passage from Michael Stalker, where Michael Stalker describes a man who's been injured and is in the hospital, and his friend, Green, did you see that? Green, it says Green right there in the text. His friend Green, the utilitarian, goes and visits him, and he goes and visits him, and the man says, "Thanks so much for visiting me, I'm so glad you really like me," and Green says, "No, I didn't do it because we're friends. I did it because I know of no one in more need of cheering up and no one easier to cheer up. You're just a utilitarian's dream, because it takes so little effort for me to give you so many units of Okay, so Socrates says, surely there's something lacking here and lacking in moral merit or value. So that's a kind of theoretical case. There's a kind of practical case, which is impossibility of responding fluently case that I averted to already. In certain fluency-demanding cases, the required reaction times for pro-moral behavior are too quick to be regulated by controlled processing. The relevant behaviors can occur only by cultivating the right sort of automatic response patterns that accord with reflective commitments. And there's two kinds of arguments you might make for this. One is an architectural argument. This result is completely unsurprising, given how the human habit system works, and given what we know about the relation between emotion and attention. So that's a kind of top-down version of the argument that would operate from first principles. There's also an inductive argument that can just operate from the facts that we know about human interactions in the face of alief-belief disharmony. This result is unsurprising given what we know about the consequences of implicit attitudes. So we know, for example, from shooter bias studies, if you ask people, you show them a bunch of images where there's either a white man or a black man holding either a telephone or a gun, to shoot in all and only cases when there's a gun. And what you discover, unsurprisingly, for individuals who live in a society structured by the sort of racial categories that our society is, where there's a confound between race and class of the sort that our society profoundly exhibits, is that there's a much higher tendency to shoot on an unarmed individual if that individual is black. Josh Green adverted already yesterday to the literature that showed that this kind of bias in which targets with more Afrocentric features are assigned more than stereotypical and negative traits is something that operates automatically. It produces a tendency to offer higher sentences. And importantly, when subjects are instructed not to use race in social judgment, their implicit race bias, but not their Afrocentric feature bias, decreases, showing that this is not something that you can regulate by Kantian top-down processes. This is something over which you have control only as the result of a certain kind of cultivation of habit. So there are biases that we have that we've been encoded as a result of living in society structured in certain kinds of hierarchical ways that we encode, over which we have no Kantian regulatory capacity. There's automatic parts of the camera system that operate just as a result of having lived in a certain community, and unless we cultivate different tendencies, there's no chance of behaving in ways that we would consider pro-moral. Likewise, in many real-time cases, right, so that was the sort of strong version, in many real-time cases, performing the relevant moral behavior is practically unfeasible without concordant attitudes or pro-moral inclinations. Why? Because regulatory mechanisms are cognitively costly and often ineffective. Josh Green gave us an example of a study yesterday where if you're trying to remember a 2-digit number, you'll choose the fruit over the cake. But if you're trying to remember a 20-digit number, you'll choose the cake over the fruit. Why? Because you're using up some of your self-regulatory capacity doing stuff. And we all walk around all the time doing things other than focusing on our interactions with other human beings. And so it behooves beings with limited cognitive capacities, like ourselves, small fronts of our brains, prefrontal cortex, limited capacity, right, to cultivate in ourselves these sorts of habits. And to do them in the way that Jim Woodward was adverting to yesterday, to make automatic in ourselves a tendency when presented with a choice of food
think not only of flavor but also of health, so that that becomes part of one's habitual response to the stimulus. So, in addition to regulatory mechanisms being costly and often ineffective, self-regulation appears to be an inexhaustible resource, something that Boris Monster has stressed. And it's often the case that explicit suppression produces rebound effects. You notice from Dan Wegner's work. I'd like you to concentrate on the screen and focus on not hallucinating an image of a white bear. Don't hallucinate an image of a white bear. Whatever you do, don't hallucinate an image of a white bear. I hope it worked for you. All right. Obviously, it's a massive group hallucination. This is just part of a big hypnosis study that I'm undertaking with you all. Okay. But we know from the automatic processing literature that there are very often rebound effects. I'm going to skip this. This is my favorite study from Jennifer Richardson. It says there's cognitive depletion following interracial interaction. And move to, I just want to show you my animated trolley slides because I think they're really nice. So here's a classic trolley case, right? You like that? Okay, so the trolley is heading down the track. It's heading to level 5. You're a switch, and you can deflect it so it kills the one instead. When I present this in my class, here's the numbers you get. 85% think that it's mandatory or permitted, 15% think it's prohibited. By contrast, give my class fat man. Okay. Okay. And when you get there, you get classic trolley results. Basically, 78% think it's forbidden. Now, what's going on here? Why am I talking about trolley cases all of a sudden? Well, because I'm at a conference where everybody's talking about trolley cases, so I thought I'd get in on the action. No, really, why am I talking about trolley cases? I'm talking about trolley cases because I think the framework that I just gave you, like what you do, we're talking about Kant and Aristotle, the framework that I just gave you gives us a way of enriching a set of insights which people like Josh Green and Lian Young and their collaborators have provided us with concerning the domain of moral dilemmas. And what I want to do is endorse pretty much everything that they say except the reading of Kant and add a little bit to it. So this is a quote from David Pizarro on a study of individuals presented with a trolley case. And it basically says this: if you present people with Fat Man and you give them one of two versions, in some cases the person making the decision is described as painfully deliberating until the very last moment with the train rapidly approaching, when he finally decides it's all the right thing to do. In other cases, the person making the decision just large man to his death while laughing. Although both perform the same kind of act with the same consequences, killing one to save 5, many think that the laughing utilitarian deserves a negative moral evaluation. Get a similar result. This is a case of Josh Green strikes the Nazis are at your door, and you're hiding, and there's a baby in the basement, and the baby's crying, and you've got to decide whether you smother the baby, in which case everybody else will be saved, or whether you don't smother the baby, in which case you and the baby and everybody else will also die. Josh points out that, like many people, you may find it difficult to settle on an answer to this question. I hope, like all people in this room, you find it difficult to settle on this question. A growing body of research points to a particular explanation, two distinct processes of moral judgment providing contradictory answers. So, with this much, I absolutely agree. And what I want to do is to go on and say some normative things about it. First, pointing out two argument parodies. So here's Josh's argument. Emotions say Kant, emotions are stupid, so Kant is stupid. Here's David's. Psychopaths are utilitarians and vice versa. Psychopaths are mean, so utilitarians are mean. Those were valid arguments. So since I reject the conclusions, I guess I reject some of the premises. But I do not do that psychopaths are mean. So who knows? All right, so let me say what I want to say normatively. So here's the quote from Darwin that I think begins to give us the key to our concern. So this is in chapter 5 of The Descent of Man. Darwin writes, the aid which we feel impelled to give to the helpless is mainly an incidental result of an instinct of sympathy, which is originally acquired as part of the social instincts, but subsequently rendered in the manner previously indicated, more tender and more widely diffused, right? So this is widening moral circle. This is Darwin, he must have read some Peter Singer. Okay. Nor could we check our sympathy even at the urging of hard reason without deterioration of the noblest part of our nature. And he goes on to talk about the doctor case. Let me say, this precedes an incredible discussion of eugenics, wherein Darwin says it's really awful that we vaccinate against smallpox because all these people who would have died in the past don't die anymore. But maybe it's reasonable, given that we can continue to have sympathy, but at the very least, those people shouldn't go on and have very many children. That's right there, you know. I read it last night on the internet. So I can tell you that it's true. But what's interesting is this thing that I put in yellow. We should not check our sympathy even at the urging of hard reason, because if we do so, we cause the deterioration of the noblest part of our nature. So I think this insight of Darwin's and this fact about moral dilemmas helps us see something really interesting about the moral structure. So there's some nice work by Philip Tetlock in which he contrasts what he calls tragic trade-offs with taboo trade-offs. And this, I think, is an empirical psychological version of a traditional debate in philosophical morality. So Tetlock points out that in the case of tragic trade-offs, cases like a Sophie's Choice situation or smothering the baby or pushing a fat man in the trolley, people are more morally condemned if they find the decision easy than if they find the decision hard. And this is analogous, I think, to a famous literature I voted to yesterday in the Jim and the Indians case by somebody who asked a question from the floor, of the fact that there's a tradition in the philosophical literature on moral dilemmas that suggests that there are residues in moral dilemmas. That is, what goes on in a moral dilemma is that when one realizes what the resolution of it is, one nonetheless continues to feel the pull in the contrary direction. And another philosophical literature that connects up to this is a literature on what's sometimes called admirable immorality. So there are cases where what's incumbent upon us is what we might call reluctant right doing. Even if I believe that A is the morally right action, it may be better for my moral elites to pull me towards not A. That is, there may be circumstances where a certain kind of disharmony is optimal given our architecture. And you can see the flip side of this in the case of what Tetlock calls taboo trade-offs. These are cases where you give thought to a possibility which many of us think you ought automatically to reject. You come and offer to buy my child for $1 million. And I say, how many dollars did you say? One is not supposed to follow up on that. The answer is supposed to be a categorical no. And this is, I think, part of what's captured in Kant's distinction between the notion of something with a price and something with a dignity. It's also picked up on it in interesting ways that I will talk about in Nomiarpoli's work on inverse opposite for those philosophers who are familiar with it. So let me just close, even though I have like 40 more slides, but Jesse's saying T, and it's not T for Tamar. Keep going. We'd love to hear the rest of your slides. Let me close with some remarks about moral evaluation, and then those of you who are really interested, like at lunch, I'll show you all my great slides, but I have slides, but so many things. Okay. So, in what cases is evaluative harmony the thing we're going for? So in some cases, behavior is morally commendable only when it's done without a conflict between or among counter and pro-moral beliefs and counter or pro-moral beliefs. So for example, Barbara Herman has a case where if you entrust me with the money for the PTA, I'm not supposed to run through a process of reasoning where I say, I wonder whether I should pocket the money or give it to the PTA. You're just supposed to give it to the PTA. If I go over to your house for dinner, I'm not supposed to think, those are really beautiful forks. Would Paul notice if I took one home with me? It's supposed to not occur to you that you could act in that way. Likewise, it's not supposed to occur to you that you could sell your child. And Bernard Williams says, if you are on a lifeboat and there are two people drowning before you, one of whom is your spouse and the other of whom is a stranger, to think, that's my spouse, and I may save my spouse despite utilitarian issues that might pull me in a contrary direction, you have had, says Williams, one thought too many. The situation is supposed to present itself to you on this moral picture as one in which you just act. evaluative harmony have in common? The hypothesis, these are cases of one of the two following instances. Cases where the conflict pits self-interest against duty, where one of the demands is a moral demand and the other of the demands is a non-moral demand. Or the cases, as in the one thought too many case, where the attitude in question is partly constituted by a certain sort of trumping alief. By contrast, what sorts of moral cases normatively produce discord, such that we praise people for feeling tension? Well, cases where, these are cases where performing the relevant moral behavior is morally commendable only when the subject experiences a conflict between pro-moral beliefs and pro-moral aliefs, where the latter generally pro-social response is morally overridden in this exceptional circumstances. So that's a footbridge with a train underneath it. That's the crying baby. These are cases, I think, where moral demands at different levels pull in different directions. So suggestion, this sort of picture that what we need is an override, is something that arises when there's two levels of moral demands. By contrast, these cases where what we are looking for when we evaluate somebody is a certain kind of harmony are cases where we either have a self-interest duty conflict or an attitude partially constituted by a certain sort of trumping alief. And I will, for fear of Jesse coming up and mugging me, stop there.
So as is our custom, do come up if you want to ask a question, but if anyone is incapable of doing so for any reason, indicate it, we'll accommodate you somehow.
So you may know that Google now is developing autonomous cars, and they've gone thousands and thousands of miles pretty much without human interaction to control it. So suppose you're programming your own car, and you have to decide, in the event of an emergency, basically the lifeboat example, does it hit your spouse or some random stranger? How do you program it? Do you consider, is it one thought too many to say, don't count the number of bodies on the other side, just go to the wife?
Yeah, good. So I take it that this is a deep question for moral philosophy, to which, I told you, I don't do ethics. I don't have an answer to that. But I do agree that if you're going to push the sort of line that I'm pushing, and it's one that I know Paul Bloom subscribes to as well, according to which these instinctive or alief-like responses are ones that we're in a position to cultivate in certain sorts of ways, then we need to think very hard about, first of all, empirical facts about the degree of fine-grainedness it's possible for them to have, right? And secondly, about what we would do under certain assumptions of fine-grainedness. So suppose it turns out that if I were to program the car so that it was a utility maximizer when it was faced with a running over situation, I would always be aware of that fact when driving and think of myself as a driver as a potential killer of my own child if she were running in front of the vehicle at this particular moment. Then one would think that isn't a good way to program a car. And I take it that it is, in some ways, an empirical question what the facts are, but that doesn't matter for the heart of your question because we ought to be able to work out if it's like this, then this, if it's like that, then that. And the answer to that is, I have absolutely no idea, but that's one of the ways of framing what it is that moral philosophy and moral psychology ought to be thinking about. What sorts of habitual responses are appropriate to cultivate in individuals structured with brains like ours?
And it was relevant in your example. It would be the distress of feeling like I'm a constant utility maximum.
That's exactly right. And that's a classic. Nothing that I'm presenting here isn't in the 150 years of sophisticated literature on the debate between Kant and consequentialists in the philosophical tradition. There's a huge amount of really cool philosophy out there.
Sorry.
So, I don't know if you're, but this is a similar question to what I raised yesterday, but I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about the relationship between the examples of the aliefs that you gave at the beginning, like not wanting to use the term, and the moral judgments that you're talking about later on, which seem, the ones you gave at the beginning seem kind of like these brute judgments that I know against my better judgment that I shouldn't be having these feelings, but not wanting to kill a soldier in a just war, or not wanting to kill the baby, those don't have the same kind of brute, irrational field.
Okay, so good. So this is one of the problems with the ways that I present alief, which is that I tend to present it with, because I had that slide already. So I use the Grand Canyon and the watch and the fudge and that contrast because it's fun. But I actually think most of what we do most of the time runs off alief. That is, I don't think it's just in the recalcitrant cases. All of my clicker usage as I was doing the talk, everything we're doing with our bodies, all of these adjustments are aliefs that are concordant with our reflective commitments. So the idea is that we have habits of response to the world that are automatic and associative, but that are nonetheless capable of being shaped in certain ways. That's what the entire literature on habit tells us. There's a whole literature on animal learning, which is about how to cultivate certain sorts of habits of response. So I don't think whether they're avowed or disavowed is what makes this a unique class. And I think I'm really serious that your response in trolley case is the result of a similar sort of mechanism to your response in Grand Canyon, your response in Watch, your response in fictional emotions cases. I mean this literally. You doubt me completely, I can tell this.
No, I'm trying to follow the response because now it sounds like what you mean by aliefs is those habits by virtue of which we perform the vast majority of our actions. But those, that sounds even less like kind of reasoned moral judgments that I could give in cases of conflict.
I'm not, right, I think the reasoned moral judgments that you give in cases of conflict are driven by a belief desire system, which you can then use to structure your life in such a way that you come to have habitual and instinctive responses that correspond to that. That's what the Nicomachean Ethics is about. It says, here's a principle. Things that are ethical and allow human beings to flourish are things that involve a moderation between extremes, right? There's pusillanimity and whatever there is, and in between is magnanimity, right? And so what you do is recognize this, and then you structure your life. You become a harpist by playing the harp, says Aristotle. You act as if you were already the person that you wish to become, and that comes to be the way that you instinctively respond to the world.
So we have about 3 minutes left. So I think this
All
is
right,
defensive.
so we can talk about
And
Mr. Green.
Thanks for a wonderful talk. I feel like I'm at office hours trying to bring my grade up from a B plus to an A minus. Maybe B plus is a little too generous. I want to distinguish between something that's come up before, and I know you've thought about a lot, a prescriptive decision procedure versus a bedrock theory of value. And clearly Kant is not prescribing as a decision procedure, just go with your well-cultivated feelings or otherwise go with the flow. Clearly Kant is very much into top-down regulation, at least product front. That's not in question. I would certainly not dispute that. Likewise, for sort of the utilitarian who goes to the bedside and so on and so forth, I think most thoughtful utilitarians would not say that we should carve out our amygdalas, so to speak, get rid of what we're doing. Those do a very good job, and that was the idea behind the camera analogy and don't cut off the leg to get rid of the Achilles heel. So if you view the dual process story and linking it to patterns in philosophy, if you view it as a kind of utilitarian decision procedure, that would suggest getting rid of the automatic responses, but that's not what I would be advocating, and likewise for Kant. Do you think that the same, can I get a better grade if I make it more clear that, that this is about where does Kant's views about what the top-down moral law really is comes from, and ideas about what our foundational moral values ought to be, as opposed to what kind of thinking we ought to be engaging in the moment. I hadn't thought about selling my children, but now that you mention it, that's actually an interesting idea. I just realized this could be on the web, Sam and Freed, I'm just kidding. If you ever want to, I'll let you know.
Good. So, I mean, in some sense, the distinction that you just drew is a crucial one, right? So there's a question about the form that moral reasoning takes, and then there's a question about the content that moral reasoning has. And with respect to the question of what's the form that moral reasoning takes, you might think the moderns are on one side and the ancients are on the other. Crudely speaking, this is really potty. So Kant and Miller on one side with respect to the formal question, and Aristotle is on the other side with respect to the formal question. That is, Kant and Miller focusing on a kind of reasoning at the moment picture of what moral decision-making looks like, though it's complicated in the case of Yale, since he thinks you get full credit whatever your reasons are for doing it. Whereas Aristotle is concerned with this cultivation of habit. There's then an additional distinction to be drawn, which is fully orthogonal to that one, and which I agree is a second strand in Kant, which has to do with the content of what it is that you're committed to when you engage in this sort of reasoning process. And there's no question, you're right, Kant's a deontologist. And one of the formulations that he offers of the categorical imperative is treat human beings in all your interactions with them as if they were not merely a means, but also an end in themselves. And so that's a content-based constraint. I think Kant gets to that content-based constraint on the basis of a certain sort of formal reasoning. But you can pull it out of Kant as a self-standing piece in the same way that I pulled the decision procedure out of Kant as a self-standing piece. And then you can argue, with respect to that as a bedrock content principle, most of the things that you've argued in Secret Joke. So I think there's room for both, and I hereby read you agree to an A. And I hope, Sam and Maria, you are listening, because your dad is doing great.
We're going to two very quick questions in. Make them something other than Kant, because that will take too long.
A quick question about aliefs. I'm not sure we need it, because in some cases you seem to be talking about what I would say imagination. When I'm standing on a height, I sort of imagine myself falling, and that causes me fear. I take an even clearer case. When I imagine a beautiful woman, I get sexually excited. At least this was true of me when I was a younger man. But I think there wasn't any commitment to treat. It's just imagination. It's just sort of, and there's another sort of case in this case, habitual action. I'm not sure you need any sort of mental representation whatsoever. So my inclination was to say that your cases of alief could sort of fall apart in cases that we had consequences.
Okay, so it is a big heterogeneous mess. Part of why I like True Confessions put up that slide with all that brown stuff on the right-hand side. Paul saw that slide before the talk started. He said, "Is that your whole talk?" I said, "No, actually I have 50 slides that accompany it." I agree that for lots and lots of things we have a distinction that we can draw between belief and imagination, between habits and reflective responses. There's no question that we have that. What we don't have is a way of having online in real time so that we can make use of it for self-understanding, a term which, for alief-like reasons, can come to be currency within our self-understanding. So it is natural for all of us, we know this from higher and symbol studies, to experience entities in the world as having beliefs and desires, and to attribute Paul's studies with the babies and the triangles do that. So belief desire psychology comes naturally to us. This is how evolved beings like us make sense of the world. There's room for limited processing beings to have kind of one other category in their online at the time of self-understanding. And so my suggestion is, because we are creatures with a leaf, we should adopt into our self-understanding a notion of alief. Even if, in some circumstances, we're going to want to make use of distinctions that are finer grained than that. And part of the reason that it's helpful to introduce into our vocabulary notion like alief is because I started out on this project thinking about fictional emotions. I wanted to know why it is that we respond with fear to movies. And it was thinking about that question that led me to recognize that there's a connection between that and what Masarin Banaji studies in the context of implicit bias, where the literature on the one could illuminate the literature on the other, vice versa. So I concede entirely that I have lumped together a huge number of things for which we have independent specifications, but it's exactly because we can't make sense of huge, messy things like that first slide that we need to sometimes, not always, lump together a whole bunch of things that in other contexts are appropriately kept apart. Just as sometimes we treat big chunks of that periodic table as being metals, And sometimes we treat big chunks of that periodic table as being particular instances of kinds of metal, each of which has different reactive properties.
Quick final query, Paul.
As you know, I'm a huge fan of analysis. I just want to make a distinction of two interesting questions. One question is, how should one live one's life? And the second question is, how do we normally, morally evaluate? There's a bit of a split, so just taking one of your examples. I think we prefer Aristotelian firemen to Kantian firemen. We want people who rush in and do their duty without any second thoughts. But I think we morally credit somebody for bravery much more if they have to struggle against fear than if they don't.
In fact, the very next slide is a slide that I didn't get to use that talks about this moral credit view of overcoming inclinations to the contrary. And I think it's very much a part. So apparently, one of the British moral philosophers of the early 20th century just found morality too easy. And so everybody at Oxford wanted to give him no moral credit because he had undergone no sort of struggle. So I do think we give moral credit to a certain kind of overcoming of contrary inclinations. And Kant is right in thinking that that is one of the things which lends moral worth to an action, both because it gives us a kind of counterfactual guarantee that even if internal stuff doesn't go right, you're going to still act in keeping with duty because you're acting from duty. And because there's a certain value which attaches to self-regulation and the capacity to overcome certain kinds of tendencies. And that's very much part of what we're talking about when we talk about morality.
Since Paul mentions the firemen, I can't resist ending with a joke. Which always comes to mind when Tamar mentions Alief. So it's about the Spanish firemen who had twins and named them Jose and Jospe. And Tamar for a church.